"What is that supposed to be, old-timer?" The voice was sharp, laced with the kind of arrogant amusement that only the very young and very sure of themselves can muster. A sick pigeon, the young Marine, no older than 20, pointed a thick manicured finger at the faded ink on Roger Morrison's forearm. His friends, 2 other Marines in crisp service uniforms, chuckled along with him. They formed a loose, intimidating semicircle around the park bench where the old man sat. Roger Morrison, 89 years old, did not react. He simply continued to look out over the park, his hands resting calmly on his knees. His gaze was fixed on the distant stage where a local high school band was setting up for the Memorial Day ceremony. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, hot dogs from a vendor cart, and the faint metallic tang of brass instruments warming up in the May sun. He had seen countless mornings like this one. The uniforms changed, the faces got younger, but the light in their eyes was always the same. "Hey, I'm talking to you," the young Marine insisted, stepping closer. His name, Evans, was stitched neatly above his right breast pocket. "Show some respect. We asked you a question." The irony of his demand was lost on him. Roger slowly turned his head, his pale blue eyes, clear and deep as a winter sky, finally meeting the corporal's. He offered no anger, no fear, no indignation. He simply looked, and in that look was a weight that Evans couldn't begin to comprehend. The confrontation had been brewing for the last 10 minutes. It started with dismissive glances at Roger's worn clothing, a simple polo shirt, faded khakis, and comfortable walking shoes. They saw a frail, elderly man who seemed out of place amidst the sea of pressed uniforms and polished metals. When he rolled up his sleeves to feel the warmth of the sun, they saw the tattoo. It was a crude thing, a simple, stylized bird with long wings, its lines blurred and its color faded to a pale grayish blue. It looked nothing like the intricate, full-sleeve masterpieces of modern military tattoos. It looked amateurish, weak. "Seriously, Pop," another Marine chimed in, leaning against a nearby oak tree. "My little sister draws better than that. You get that in a back alley?" Corporal Evans took it a step further. He crossed his arms, puffing out his chest, a gesture of dominance as old as time. "You know, we see a lot of guys your age walking around with military surplus gear, telling war stories that never happened. That ink doesn't mean anything. Let me see some ID. Let me see a veteran's card. Prove you earned the right to be here today." The demand hung in the air, sharp and ugly. It was a direct challenge to his honor, delivered in a public space on the most sacred day of the military calendar. A small crowd of onlookers began to form a wider circle around the scene. A mother pulled her child closer. A few teenagers started recording on their phones, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and discomfort. The atmosphere in the park, once festive and respectful, had curdled. Roger Morrison sighed, a soft, almost inaudible sound. It was not a sigh of weariness or defeat, but of profound, bone-deep patience. He had survived things that would have shattered these young men into a million pieces. He had endured hardships they could only read about in sanitized history books. Their mockery was like a child's tantrum in the face of a mountain, annoying but ultimately insignificant. He slowly, deliberately reached into his back pocket and retrieved a worn leather wallet. It was old, the seams frayed, the leather softened by decades of use. The Marines watched his every move, their smirks unwavering. They saw his slightly trembling hands and mistook age for fear. They saw his silence and mistook it for weakness. Evans leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Come on, Grandpa. Let's see it. Or are you going to tell us you left it in your other pants? I bet you don't even know what branch you're pretending to be from." Another of the Marines snickered. "Probably the Space Force, right? From the Punic Wars." The laughter was jarring against the backdrop of taps being practiced softly in the distance. Each note of the mournful bugle call seemed to be a rebuke to their behavior. The crowd grew larger, the murmurs louder. People were shaking their heads in disgust, but no one intervened. The sight of 3 uniformed Marines, radiating an aura of official authority, kept them at bay. They were a pack, confident in their strength and status, and Roger was their isolated target. Roger's fingers, gnarled with arthritis but still steady, fumbled for a moment with the wallet's clasp. The leather was smooth under his touch, a familiar comfort. He could feel every crease, every worn spot. It was the same wallet he had carried for 60 years. It had been with him through the births of his children, the funerals of his friends, and the quiet, lonely decades after his beloved wife had passed. As he opened it, his thumb brushed against the faded albatross on his forearm. The sting, that was the first thing. Not a clean, buzzing sting from a sanitized parlor needle, but a raw, scraping burn. The air was thick with the smell of salt, diesel fuel, and stale sweat. the oppressive humidity of a jungle island that had known nothing but war for months. He wasn't on a park bench, he was crammed into the belly of a landing craft, its engine a low, gut-rumbling throb against the hull. The needle was a sharpened piece of shrapnel. The ink was a mixture of gunpowder and brackish water, stirred in a dirty ration tin. A young man, barely 18, with terror and determination warring in his eyes, was holding his arm steady while another carved the bird into his skin. A promise. A pact made in the shadow of death. Remember us. Remember what we did here. The image vanished as quickly as it came, a ghost of sensation against his skin. He pulled out his driver's license and an old laminated military ID card. The photo on the ID was of a young man with a sharp jaw and fearless eyes, a ghost from another lifetime. He handed them to Corporal Evans. Evans snatched the cards from his hand. He glanced at the driver's license, noting the name Roger Morrison and the date of birth that confirmed his advanced age. Then he focused on the military ID, his eyes narrowing. The card was an older format, one he didn't recognize. This could be a fake, Evans declared loudly, holding it up for his friends to see. These are easy to forge. What were you, a cook, a supply clerk? He was fishing, trying to get a rise out of the old man, to force him into a defensive posture, but Roger remained silent, his gaze once again drifting towards the stage. He had given them what they asked for. The rest was just noise. He knew how this worked. Men like Evans fed on reaction. The best way to starve them was to give them nothing. Across the park lawn, a man named Henderson watched the scene unfold with a slow burning fury. A retired master gunnery sergeant, Henderson had spent 30 years in the Marine Corps. He knew the look of these young, arrogant troopers. He had trained hundreds of them. He had also seen men like Roger Morrison before, quiet, unassuming veterans who carried the weight of history in their stooped shoulders. He saw the disrespect, the public shaming, and it made his blood boil. He hadn't paid much attention to the tattoo, but he recognized the type of man being harassed, the quiet professional, the kind who never boasted because the things they had done were beyond words. When he heard Corporal Evans say the name Roger Morrison out loud, something clicked in the back of his mind. It wasn't a familiar name, but the way the whole situation felt, the absolute certainty of the old man, his utter refusal to be baited, set off alarm bells. This was not a man you trifled with. Henderson moved away from the crowd, pulling out his cell phone. He didn't call the local police. He knew that would only escalate the situation and further humiliate the old veteran. He scrolled through his contacts to a number he hadn't used in years, the direct line to the aide of the current base commander at Camp Lejeune. Sergeant Major. A crisp voice answered on the other end. This is Master Gunnery Sergeant Henderson. Retired, he said, his voice low and urgent. I'm at the Memorial Day ceremony in the town square. There's a situation. 3 of your young corporals are publicly harassing an elderly veteran. Their conduct is a disgrace to the uniform. I see. Can you give me their names? The loudmouth's name is Evans. I can't see the others, but that's not the important part. Henderson took a deep breath. They're questioning his service. The old man's name is Roger Morrison. Morrison. I don't know who he is, but there's something wrong with this picture, Sergeant Major. You need to get someone down here, someone with rank. Now, he emphasized the final word, his voice carrying the ingrained authority of a man who had commanded troops in combat. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Roger Morrison, the aide repeated slowly. Understood, Master Guns. We're on it. The line went dead. Henderson put his phone away, his eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. He had lit the fuse. Now he could only wait for the explosion. He just hoped it would come in time. Inside the base commander's office at Camp Lejeune, the sergeant major turned from the phone, his face pale. Colonel Matthews, a man with a chest full of ribbons from Iraq and Afghanistan, looked up from his paperwork. What is it, Sergeant Major? Sir, I just got a call from a retired Master Guns. 3 of our Marines are harassing an elderly veteran at the ceremony downtown. Corporal Evans is the ringleader. The colonel's face hardened. A disgrace. Get the MPs down there. I want them brought back to base and put on report immediately. Sir, there's more, the sergeant major said, his voice hesitant. The veteran's name, it's Roger Morrison. The name hung in the air-conditioned silence of the office. Colonel Matthews froze, his pen hovering over a document. He slowly put it down. Say that again. Roger Morrison, sir. The colonel stared at his aide for a long moment, then turned to his computer. His fingers flew across the keyboard, typing the name into a secure military database. He clicked search. The file that appeared was highly classified, marked with warnings that would make most officers log off immediately. The colonel's eyes scanned the first few lines, his expression shifting from anger to disbelief, and then to something that looked like pure, unadulterated shock. He stood up so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Get me the Commandant of the Marine Corps' office." Now, miles away, at a regional headquarters, Admiral Thorne was adjusting the cuffs on his immaculate dress white uniform. He was the guest of honor at the ceremony, scheduled to give the keynote address. He was a 4-star admiral, a man who commanded fleets, a man for whom presidents cleared their schedules. His aide, a young, sharp-as-a-tack lieutenant, stood by with a polished binder containing his speech. The admiral's secure phone buzzed. The lieutenant answered it, listened for a moment, and his face went slack. "Sir," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "it's Colonel Matthews from Lejeune. It's an urgent flag officer matter." The admiral took the phone. "Thorne." He listened, his stern, public-facing facade remaining perfectly still. But the lieutenant, who had worked for him for 3 years, saw the subtle shift, a tightening around the eyes, a muscle twitching in his jaw, the color draining from his face. The admiral said only 2 words into the phone, "I'm coming." He handed the phone back to his aide. His movements were no longer ceremonial. They were sharp, precise, and filled with an almost violent urgency. "Scramble my escort," the admiral commanded, his voice a low growl that vibrated with authority. "Tell them we are leaving now. Clear a path to the town square, and get my car. Now." Back in the park, Corporal Evans was reaching the end of his patience. The old man's silence was more infuriating than any insult. It was a passive defiance that was chipping away at his authority in front of a growing hostile crowd. He felt the need to end this, to assert his dominance once and for all. He handed the ID cards back, not to Roger's hand but dropping them onto his lap. "All right, old man, I've had enough of your games," Evans snarled, stepping so close his shadow fell over Roger. "You're clearly disoriented, a danger to yourself and others. You are causing a public disturbance. I want you to get up and leave this park immediately. If you don't, I'm calling base security to have you escorted out for a full psychiatric evaluation. Maybe a few days in observation will clear your head." It was the ultimate threat, the final act of humiliation. He was threatening to have a veteran stripped of his dignity and freedom on Memorial Day. The crowd gasped. A woman shouted, "Leave him alone." But Evans was too far gone, lost in his own power trip. He reached out, his hand preparing to grab Roger's arm and haul him to his feet. He never made it. A sound cut through the air, sharp and insistent. It wasn't the town police siren. It was the powerful, unmistakable wail of a military police escort. Heads turned. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as a motorcade of 3 black sedans, led by 2 MP vehicles with lights flashing, sliced through the park, driving directly onto the grass, and stopping just yards from the bench. The sudden silence was absolute. Even the high school band stopped their warm-up. The doors of the lead sedan opened. A young lieutenant practically leaped out, followed by a captain. They snapped to attention. Then from the rear passenger door, a figure emerged. He was tall and imposing, his dress white uniform a startling, brilliant contrast to the green of the park. 4 silver stars glittered on each of his shoulder boards. Medals cascaded down his chest in a dazzling, intimidating display of a long and storied career. It was Admiral Thorne. The young Marines froze. Their blood ran cold. Corporal Evans felt a wave of nausea so intense he thought he might be sick. A 4-star admiral was here, in their park, and he was walking directly towards them. His face was a mask of cold fury. The admiral didn't even glance at the 3 young Marines. His eyes were locked on the old man sitting on the bench. He strode across the grass, his polished black shoes sinking slightly into the turf, and stopped directly in front of Roger Morrison. He did not speak. He did not offer a hand. Instead, with a precision that was breathtaking to behold, Admiral Thorne brought his heels together with an audible click, raised his right hand and rendered the slowest, most respectful salute Corporal Evans had ever seen. He held it, his arm as rigid as steel, his gaze locked on the old man's eyes. The crowd stared, utterly bewildered. The Marines were paralyzed with a dawning, horrifying sense of dread. What was happening? Who was this old man? The Admiral's aide, the young lieutenant, stepped forward and cleared his throat. He held a tablet in his hand, and his voice, amplified by the sudden profound silence, carried across the entire park. "Roger Morrison," the lieutenant began, his voice ringing with a formal, powerful cadence. "United States Marine Corps, enlisted 1942, assigned to the 1st Marine Raider Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson." A wave of murmurs went through the veterans in the crowd. The Raiders, they were legends, ghosts. The lieutenant continued, his voice growing stronger, awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism on the night of September 13, 1942, during the Battle of Edson's Ridge on Guadalcanal. When his platoon's machine gun nest was overrun, Private Morrison single-handedly counterattacked with a bayonet and hand grenades, reclaiming the position and holding it for 6 hours against repeated enemy assaults, sustaining multiple severe injuries in the process. Corporal Evans felt his knees tremble. Edson's Ridge, Bloody Ridge, every Marine knew that story. It was sacred ground, a foundational myth of the Corps. After his recovery, the aide went on, his voice unwavering. He volunteered for a new experimental unit, a special operations force, so secret their records were sealed for 50 years. They called themselves the Albatross Raiders. They operated deep behind enemy lines in the Pacific, disrupting supply lines, gathering intelligence, and eliminating high-value targets. Of the 50 men who formed that unit, only 2 survived the war. The lieutenant paused and looked directly at the faded crude tattoo on Roger's forearm. Their unofficial symbol, tattooed on each man as a bond of brotherhood, was a simple albatross, a symbol of those who wander far from home. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Phones were no longer just recording. They were broadcasting a living piece of history. The old veterans in the audience were openly weeping. The young Marines looked as if they had been turned to stone. The sick pigeon, the back alley joke, it was a sacred relic, a mark of unimaginable sacrifice, and they had spat on it. The aide concluded. Roger Morrison retired from the Marine Corps in 1965 with the rank of Sergeant Major. His service record remains one of the most decorated in the history of Marine Corps Special Operations. He is a living legend. The lieutenant stepped back. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Admiral Thorne finally, slowly, lowered his salute. He leaned down slightly, his voice for Roger's ears alone but filled with a profound, aching respect. "It is an honor, Sergeant Major. A profound honor." Roger simply nodded, a small, sad smile touching his lips. Then the Admiral straightened up. He turned, and the full, terrifying force of his 4-star fury fell upon Corporal Evans and his 2 friends. His voice was not loud. It was a low, glacial whisper that was somehow more terrifying than any shout. "You 3, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You wear the uniform of Carlson's Raiders and Chesty Puller. You stand on ground consecrated by the blood of men like this, Sergeant Major, and you use it to bully a hero, to mock a symbol you are not worthy to even look at." He took a step closer. "You have disgraced yourselves. You have disgraced your fellow Marines. You have disgraced the memory of every man and woman who ever wore this eagle, globe, and anchor." He pointed a trembling finger at them. "I want your names. I want your units, and you will report to my office at 0600 tomorrow. Your careers as you know them are over, but your education is about to begin. Now get out of my sight." The 3 Marines, their faces ashen, stumbled over themselves to obey, disappearing into the crowd like ashamed ghosts. The Admiral turned back to Roger. "I am so sorry, Sergeant Major. Deeply, truly sorry for the disrespect you were shown." Roger Morrison finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear, filled with a gentle grace that seemed impossible after the ordeal he had just endured. He looked at the Admiral, then at the retreating forms of the young Marines. "They're just kids, Admiral," he said, and his voice carried in the quiet. "They're full of pride, and that's what we teach them to be. They haven't seen enough yet to know what to look for. Don't ruin them, teach them." As he spoke those words of wisdom, a final fleeting image surfaced in his mind's eye. The humid jungle night, the metallic smell of blood. His best friend, a boy from Ohio named Danny, was lying beside him in a muddy foxhole, his breathing shallow. It was Danny who had just finished carving the albatross onto Roger's arm. Roger took the sharpened shrapnel from him, dipped it in the gunpowder ink, and began to carve the same bird onto Danny's arm. It was a promise. If one of them made it home, he would live for both of them. He would remember. Danny had died before the sun rose. The tattoo wasn't a badge of honor. It was a scar, a memorial, a heavy lifelong burden. The fallout was swift, but not in the way anyone expected. Influenced by Roger's words, Admiral Thorne chose education over destruction. Corporal Evans and his friends were not discharged. They were stripped of their rank, reduced to private, and assigned to a new program the Admiral himself designed. For the next year, they would spend every weekend escorting elderly veterans to their appointments at the VA hospital, listening to their stories, and volunteering at the local military museum, cleaning exhibits and learning the history they had so easily mocked. A mandatory new heritage program was instituted across the entire base, focusing on the oral histories of veterans from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. The story of Roger Morrison and the Albatross Raiders was declassified and became the first lesson for every new recruit. Several months later, a humbled Private Evans was mopping the floor in the hallway of the VA hospital. He looked up and saw Roger Morrison walking slowly toward him, on his way to a physical therapy appointment. Evans's heart pounded in his chest. He froze, leaning on his mop, a dozen apologies dying on his lips. He expected the old man to ignore him, to walk by with the cold disdain he so richly deserved. But Roger stopped. He looked at the young man, at his lowered eyes and shamed posture. He saw not an arrogant corporal, but a chastened private who was finally learning the weight of his uniform. Evans finally found his voice, a choked whisper. "Sergeant Major, I am so sorry." Roger Morrison looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached out a frail, steady hand and placed it on the young man's shoulder. He gave it a gentle squeeze, a gesture of forgiveness, of understanding, of continuity. He didn't say a word. He just nodded, once, and then continued on his way down the hall, leaving a profoundly changed young Marine standing in his wake. The story of Roger Morrison is a powerful reminder that heroes don't always wear their greatness on their sleeves. Sometimes, it's hidden in plain sight, in a faded tattoo and the quiet dignity of a life lived in service to others. If you were moved by this story of valor and respect, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories of unassuming heroes.